Okay, today we'd like to take a look at Schliermacher, the 19th century philosopher who really set a new trend in hermeneutics, established a new turning point in hermeneutics by emphasizing the interpreter himself, in other words, the psychology behind hermeneutics. And it is philosophical hermeneutics, even though he did emphasize the Christian religion. It was a philosophical hermeneutics, which meant the interpretation of history and text, not just text. And his most important work was his work entitled The Christian Faith, but there was a condensed version of that published in 1911, and it does not eliminate any of the important essential data, and so this presentation of his hermeneutics comes from that 1911 text. And it was put together by George Cross, like I say, in 1911, and it does present Schleiermacher presents his hermeneutic with an emphasis on the interpreter, so it's an anthropological or a psychological presentation, and that's why he's so important again today. It's because he really launched philosophers to start thinking in a postmodern way. So he kind of led into it. He emerged in the 19th century, so he influenced all three of the big 20th century hermeneutic philosophers, Dilthey, Heidegger, and Gadamer. They all entered into dialogue with Schleiermacher, so he was extremely important, and now he's resurfacing in the 21st century because of this work that he established back in 1911 that is now being referenced again and again by the philosophers in the 21st century. But it's fundamentally because he brings in psychology, for one of the first ones to do so. And he has a very unique way of looking at that psychology. And we'll look there first. We're going to look at the unconscious, because he has his first take, which was very differed a great deal from the current trend in his time, was to look at religious conversion as an action that takes place, or an event that takes place, in the unconscious and not in consciousness. So religious conversion takes place in the explored unconscious. And it is the original experience of the self-conscious self in the form of feeling. So it's not to be associated with the the rationalistic view of the day, where it's a kind of a cognitive assent to a series of doctrines. Conversion is not a cognitive assent to a series of doctrines. It is an emotional feeling state, and it's the original experience of the self-consciousness. But this conversion describes a state of being consisting of feeling, where the self is primarily receptive and not cognitively assenting, but is primarily receptive. Now, later on, he's going to talk about the objective self-consciousness emerging in the realm of consciousness, and that is going to build on this kind of proto-self-consciousness that develops in the unconscious. Now, the self's confrontation with the external world leads to a double experience of the self realizes opportunities for freedom and spontaneity, and also the impress of a dependence and receptivity. So the self is kind of caught in this unconscious duality, this unconscious tension. Conversion equals, for Schleiermacher, it is the experience of absolute dependence on the divine. The experience of absolute dependence. And he says we reach this through three stages of the unconscious. And the first is we begin in the animalistic stage, where the subjective slash objective division has not yet taken place. We don't have not yet formed a distinction at the animalistic level of a distinction between subjective and objective. But then we pass through the sensuous dimension, stage 2, and that's when the subjective-objective division first evolves, but the self is still being disturbed and influenced by the sensuality side of life, and not really being dominated by God consciousness. So kind of a transition there. And then the third stage is the religious absolute dependence. The subjective-objective division is actually reconciled in the subjectivity of the new objective self-consciousness. And what Schliermacher points out, which is really good, he says, really, this isn't like Hegel, where we're going to go, thesis, antithesis, and then we're going to synthesize the two together. He said it's not a synthesis. The third stage is really a reciprocal relationship between stage 2 and stage 3. That's where we end up. We end up in stage 3 of absolute dependence on the divine God consciousness, but we interact continually with the sensuous world of stage 2, so it's a continual positing of the self into the sensuous externality, and then we return out of that sensuous externality back into the self until we acquire greater and greater and greater depths of understanding the God consciousness. So this third stage is really reciprocal and not a synthesis. And that constitutes the religious. So we go from the animalistic to the sensuous to the religious. Now, a second aspect of the unconscious is this proto-self-consciousness constitutes itself as a feeling body state or as a subset. And he says that the self-consciousness is involved in that process of repressing the sensuous in that dialogue back and forth between stage 2 and stage 3. And this continual dialectical relationship eventually will lead the self to gravitate towards a subset of communal reinforcement. In other words, you're going to associate with those that are gravitating toward the same dimensions that are important to you. So it eventually will lead to the self to gravitate towards a subset of communal reinforcement when certain dispositions are shared by a group of individuals. And this will occur through word, action, and emotion. So then he says a resultant feeling body state will emerge, but it's a feeling body state that gets reinforced through this kind of a proto-community reinforcement of each other when you just kind of congregate with a like is attracted to like. If you share certain dispositions concerning your convictions concerning God consciousness, you will associate with that group and you will reinforce each other. And that will help you to constitute a feeling body state. And from there, he says, that will lead to higher and higher realizations of God consciousness. And he says it will result a shared group of very fundamental dispositions. He said there are some dispositions we can generically define. We can't define all the particularities because every community group is going to vary. He says there will be some generic ones within the Christian proto-self-consciousness. And that is, number one, the divine is considered a unity. Number two, the world is considered a unity also. 3, the self is established as being in a state of absolute dependence. But the self has an inner tendency toward attaining to higher and higher realizations of the divine God consciousness. And this tendency to attain to God can emerge in three ways. Schleiermacher says it will evolve through ethics, through a teleology of a direction in history, historical direction, and the third is aesthetic artistic expression. So ethical action, teleological direction, historical direction, or as aesthetic artwork, art expression. So so that God consciousness can evolve in any of those three ways, or those three together in a reciprocal relationship. So once the self has passed through the conversion experience, and then through kind of a proto-community of reinforcement, develops this emotional feeling state, or feeling body state, and ends up with a shared fundamental group of generic beliefs, then the self is ready to put together, to internally posit in the subconscious. This is pre-linguistic, so it's putting this together in a feeling percept kind of a way. You got to think of this as not a statement of language. Think of it as a feeling of a conviction. You know, that you feel this is right or you feel this is wrong. He says we develop a realm of memory in the unconscious for these feelings of our convictions. After we've developed this feeling body state, we're going to develop a motivational set of feeling percepts of our convictions. And he said that the reference point for this set of convictions is looking at the incarnation of the divine that is at work in history. Schliermacher says that we share a conviction that incarnation began with creation. God entered into the finite at the very moment of creation, so it didn't happen later in Jesus Christ only. Incarnation began with creation. So we can look at the work of the divine raising up and purifying creation as an ongoing incarnation process. That will help us to reference and to build this motivational conviction set of feeling percepts. And then also, of course, he says we have the reference of the career and the character of Jesus of Nazareth as a reference point. And he says that will, those two together, the incarnation process and the life event of Jesus of Nazareth, together help us to shape a fundamental base conviction. And that fundamental base conviction, we could, other writers have labeled it horizon. It's like your teleological horizon. And he said, and that, in his case, is concerning the fact that the whole of existence is determined by divine communication. The whole of existence is determined by divine communication. And then under this base conviction, this fundamental base generic horizon, all of the feeling percepts can be organized. So this base generic conviction or horizon that sees that all of existence is determined by the word or the divine communication of the divine will give us the horizon within which to shape all of our motivational feeling percepts, and we will store these in the motivational set realm of the unconscious. And that as a whole, as grouped all together, gives us a feeling of a deep inner certainty of redemption. It gives us kind of a a concretion. We kind of consolidate all that into a singularity, and that singularity of certainty of redemption, that feeling body state is going to be transferred into consciousness, where we can start articulating it in a cognitive way. And for Schliermacher, that means the very first thing, as we mentioned before, is proto-subjectivity will be articulated as objective subjectivity. And the motivational set in the unconscious has an inherent self-actualizing tendency to express itself in actuality, and this tendency gives birth to the idea of a system of signs, and the self wants to give form to the inner content of blessedness, and this establishes the self-consciousness who will carry out these operations. An objective, articulating, cognitive self-consciousness emerges. To do the work in the temporary workspace of consciousness for the articulation of our conversion experience and what it means for our external world. And so when he talks about articulations in the realm of consciousness, he says what we're really articulating is we're looking at the referential point of a series of pious impulses. That's an interesting concept for him, because he says what that is when we get involved in that second stage and the third stage of conversion, where we take our God consciousness and then work through sensuous reality and then get a return out of that, but continually through the process we learn how to better and better and better repress the pure sensuous and to work towards something more meaningful. He said that creates a whole series of what he calls pious impulses. Impulses of the divine that we can kind of keep stored in our unconscious memory. Well, in consciousness we articulate those impulses. And so he says, if you think about it, those pious impulses are praxis-oriented because they are actions and reflections within a concrete, particular historical situation. A concrete, particular historical situation. And the series of pious impulses emerge out of this praxis-based involvement in externality, but while filtering it through the career and character of the Christ event, because we filter it through the career and the character of the Christ event. Now, based on all this, we're going to acquire signs of pointing from this dialogue or dialectic between stage 2 and 3, between God consciousness and the sensuous externality, and then we're going to compile those into a construction of a sign model, and Schliermacher calls it the redemption sign model of our new consciousness of absolute dependence. It's the articulation of the redemption sign model from the new self-consciousness of absolute dependence. And he marks it up for us in a triad, which makes it much more easy to understand. But he says, first of all, you've got the doctrine of the self-consciousness, which is absolute dependence, which governs all of the sensuous impulses with a tendency towards the perfection of the world consciousness. So that's the first part of the triad. Second part of the triad is going to be the doctrine of the external world, which is finite and dependent on the infinite word of the God consciousness. He says that that evil and good share the same realm. We don't divide the external world into like an evil dimension and a good dimension. They coexist in the same historical dimension. but there's a tendency in the external world toward the universal consciousness. So he says that this process of building this redemption sign model will lead us from self-consciousness through evolving world consciousness to the goal of universal consciousness, which will, of course, unite the subjective and the objective together into a reciprocal model of a higher God consciousness. And he says when we do that, we're going to develop the Christian doctrine that usually gets addressed right away in hermeneutics. He waits till he gets through this whole process. He says, now we can talk about doctrine, because now you base your doctrine on these unconscious substrate and the working consciousness together, and then you can develop your Christian doctrine, and you deal with, he deals specifically with the real fundamental doctrines, the doctrine of God and the doctrine of the external world. But for the doctrine of God, he has a very unique position. He says, first of all, there's no objective knowledge of God. God is absolute causality, and he rewrites the attributes. As eternal, it just means that God conditions all that is temporal. As omnipresent, it simply means that there's no place in the world that is destitute of a potential for a religious stimulus. As almighty, it just means that nature is grounded in the infinite causality of God. And omniscience simply means that the external world is immersed in an absolute spirituality, which is that ongoing incarnation process that began with creation. It didn't begin with the birth of Christ. Incarnation began with the birth of creation. God immediately incarnated the world and started to work it out toward his perfection. And so that incarnation process is what defines our understanding of all-knowing, or omniscience. It's because that incarnation process creates that all-presence. Now the external world, he says, is that every world impression has the potential capability of exerting religious feeling. World history is developing. It never reaches complete perfection. And he says that we do posit an original perfection of the world and an original perfection of humanity. The world incites the self to an activity of acquiring knowledge of the divine. And humanity possesses this inner impulse toward God consciousness already as a distinct inherent quality of its nature, including the readiness to establish a community of God consciousness. And Schliermacher says this is inherent to the human disposition. So, just quickly, for Schleiermacher, you're looking at the unconscious beginning in religious conversion, which takes place in the explored unconscious. It'll pass through the animalistic, the sensuous, and then the religious, until it reaches the state of absolute dependence. And then the second realm within the unconscious is the constituting a feeling body state as a subset of kind of a proto-community where we will gravitate toward those that share our convictions concerning God consciousness. Once we reach that realm, we develop that third realm in the unconscious of the motivational set, and that evolves because we first create a basic fundamental conviction which functions as a horizon which guides all of our feeling percept formations of conviction. And that base conviction is that the whole of existence is determined by divine communication. That transfers us into consciousness. The first work there is to establish and to articulate the objective subjectivity, and then that will lead us to articulating what he calls the pious impulses of the self, working back and forth through the sensuous realm in stage 2, using the God consciousness of stage 3 to repress the dominance of the sensuous. So when we do work through that process and articulate those pious impulses, we will slowly build, progressively build a redemption sign model. And by building the redemption sign model, we will increasingly refine our definitions of Christian doctrine, and we will no longer cling to these metaphysical Christian doctrines. Our Christian doctrines are going to be more postmodern and will be demythologized and have the metaphysical structure deconstructed so that they can evolve in a more mature fashion. And that's from a condensed version of his book, The Christian Faith. The condensed version was published in 1911, and very, very influential thinker. His system was picked up by everybody. I mean, Dilthey, Heidegger, and Gadamer all responded to Schliermacher. So Schliermacher, The Christian Faith, and very accessible. I'll give it graduate level, but it's really a very accessible work, so you shouldn't have too much trouble with this text. Thanks. Got her in for, that's good, 25 minutes. All right.